Hi, this is Eli Kranzberg, and welcome to this series on Studio 1.6. We're going to be taking a fresh look from the ground up, and for those of you who've worked with earlier versions of Studio One, you're going to notice some new improved features starting right here with the Start page. Now, when you first launch Studio One, this is the page that comes up by default, and I say by default because it can be changed for something else to happen. But this page is the central location for where you manage all your documents and device configuration and artist profile, and you get a news feed. And we have three basic types of documents that we work with in Studio One. We have songs, you'll see them here, and this is what we use to create, write, compose, and edit music. We have projects, and this is what we use for mastering, to string together finished mixes to master them for a CD or an album. And then we have shows, which are designed for live use, for triggering synths live and using backing tracks or playing live instruments with effects and managing set lists and so on for live shows. And we'll be spending most of this series in the song format where we create music. And of course, we have a recent files area here. Now, producers or mixing engineers working with different artists and clients can now, new in Studio One, create and manage separate artist profiles, and they're stored in an artist profile preset. And we get to that area here. And you can do all this from the Start page, but you can also go in once you're within Studio One past the Start page and edit these. But this is a good place to start. So I'm going to create a profile for myself. I'm just going to drag and drop a picture on there, and it's asking me if I want to resize it, and I'll go yes. And it's got my name because that's who this version is registered to. And I'm going to type in genre. It's going to type in jazz and pop. And then we can optionally link to a website. Now here, I've got this X if I want to get rid of that and remove the image. And I got this drop-down menu, which shows me where the demos and tutorials are on the hard drive in my user folder, Documents, Studio One, Demos and Tutorials. It's going to click Cancel. But here's the new part where this is the profile I've just created, and I can go Add Artist and then create another profile. Now, the advantage of these artist profiles is that they include the name, genre, and website in the image, but the information is also automatically embedded as ID3 tags when we export a mixdown, when we're exporting to any of the compressed audio formats like MP3 or MP4 and FLAC. So useful for that metadata. Now, there's also a new restructured new document window here. We use this to open existing projects from here if they're not in the recent files list. And here's a new join button for connecting with PreSonus Sphere and collaborating with other users. Now, when we press new, we're going to get the new smart templates that are provided in Studio 1.6, and they're great for essential workflows like basic recording, mixing stems, mastering an album, or you can simply play an instrument, or you can also use them for creating a podcast or preparing or rehearsing and performing a live show. And we have user templates and the factory smart templates. So these are completely unique in the way that they combine a basic set of pre-configured tracks and channels with a customized user interface. And that's also new in Studio 1.6, where you can customize what's visible. And it'll also even automatically download required content. And there's even step-by-step tutorials, and some of them like this, you'll see include a drop zone for importing files. So that will open up a basic Studio One song. This will open up a project for mastering. This will open up a show. And here's just to play right away. It'll call up a synth, and again, download content if necessary. I'm just going to click OK. I'm not going to go through all the fields, but just to show you, I can right away get a tutorial showing me important areas. It's highlighting, click there to open up the instrument. Just a step-by-step simple tutorial. Click there to change the preset on the instrument. Check there to make sure your external device is configured properly. And you can import backing tracks, and you're ready to play. And so on. I'm just going to hit Command W to close the document without saving anything. We're back to the Start page. Now here, another new feature in recent files, we can pin these if we want to get specific files pinned to the top so that they always appear here. And this is great when you have a long list. And of course, right now I don't, so it's not critical, but we can pin files. And then we can also create folders to better organize the songs, projects, and shows that we're working on. So welcome to Studio 1.6. In the next video, we're going to continue on the Start page and look at configuring our audio and external devices. The start page is the central location that opens by default, where we manage our documents, configure our devices, set up our artist profile, and also get access to a news feed. And there are three main types of documents we work with in Studio One 6: songs for creating and editing music, projects for mastering, and shows for live performance. And we can now manage multiple artist profiles with artist profile presets that contain information that are embedded as tags when we export mixdowns in any of these compressed formats. And we now also have smart templates for basic workflows, and they contain pre-configured tracks and channels, a customized interface, and they'll even download the content if you haven't already downloaded, and provide some basic tutorial starting points. We'll continue with more in the next video. In this video, I want to look at managing your Studio One content installation and configuring your basic audio and MIDI hardware. Now, there's a new consolidated Studio One installation process available in Studio One 6, and we get to it from under the Studio One menu on top here. And if we go down to Studio One installation, we have a kind of revised, easier to work menu here, where we can search and filter for the content that's available, and we have available updates there and installed content there and available downloads and so on. And it's simple a matter of clicking what you want or don't want, and you can filter here and then just click install from, select all, different install options, and so on. And you can also alternatively install files directly from your My PreSonus account page. Now, we also need to set up our audio hardware, and we can get to it directly from the start page, configure audio device, and this opens up the preferences window brought up with the tab for audio setup. I'm just going to close it just to show you that you can also get to it from under Studio One preferences, and we have these tabs over here. So first thing is to make sure that your audio device is recognized and selected, and you'll see a list of your available hardware connected to your studio. Now, if it's not appearing here, you'll need to go to the Audio MIDI Setup app in your Mac OS and make sure you have the proper drivers installed and that your actual operating system on the computer is recognizing it. So from here, it's a simple matter of choosing the device that you want to be using for playback, basically for output and input, and usually they're the same, but not necessarily. And here we have the device block size, and the general rule of thumb here is the lower you have this, the lower or less latency you're going to encounter. Latency meaning the time from when you, let's say, speak into your mic or play your guitar or hit your keyboard until you hear the sound back. So lower values are better for latency, but they're also more taxing on your computer. Higher values are less taxing, but you'll hear latency. So generally when you're recording and working, you want to have as low a latency as you can. And when you're mixing, you can increase it if necessary to get more power from your computer. We can set the sample rate here, and that's going to be based on your audio hardware for what's available. And you get a simple readout of the input latency and output latency generated by these buffer settings. And you can see if I increase this here, let's say 512, these numbers will go up. So I'm going to keep it at 128. I can even go down to 64, and it'll probably be fine where I get really imperceptible latency. Now here on the second page, we have audio dropout protection, which is kind of an advanced native low latency monitoring system. And with this, basically the tasks of audio playback and monitoring of audio inputs and virtual instruments are handled as separate processes. So it's a way of getting the least latency possible when you're using lower buffer sizes. It uses its own buffer for playback and processing of audio tracks, and we can change the settings here and it'll change this process size. And as this goes up, you'll see this little low latency icon here, meaning that low latency monitoring for instruments is available, and you can turn it on or off here. And we can turn it on or off separately within the console, within Studio One songs, but that's a separate thing. Just for the basic setup, we set the dropout protection here. And again, the higher this goes, the greater the latency is, but you can also optionally enable the low latency mode to minimize that. And enabling plugin nap is another way to minimize the potential for audio dropouts. When audio isn't passing through an actual plugin, it reduces the resources that are needed. So it's good to leave that on by default, and you can selectively enable or disable it for individual plugins if you want to within plugin manager. So that's a basic audio setup. Now let's look at external devices. I happen to have a Novation Impulse keyboard connected, and that's what's being used. And I'm just going to remove it and show you how to create it from scratch. So I'm going to go add a new one, and you get a list of available devices. So look for your manufacturer and your device, and hopefully it'll be there. In my case, there's no category for Novation, so I have to create it from new. So I'm going to go new keyboard, and this is for when it's a MIDI keyboard controller and it's not an actual instrument that's generating sound. And device model, again, and manufacturer and name. So I'm going to just type in Novation and my device name. I'll call it that just so we can identify it. And here we can selectively enable or disable whatever MIDI channels we want used. And they're all on by default. You can turn them all off there and just select the ones you need. I'm going to leave them all on. Generally, I only use one channel, but in case I'm using some multi-timbral instruments and I want to access some other channels, I want to leave it on. And receive from, and here's where you choose the keyboard that's connected to your system. And again, if it's not appearing here, you'll need to go to the audio MIDI setup and make sure you have the proper drivers installed so that it's recognized by your system. So this is my Impulse keyboard, and there's also a MIDI input on it, and I'm not using that, so I want it to receive from that. And I can filter out any of these messages if I want, and mine actually leaks some pitch bend information. It's something I have to get repaired, but for now I'm going to filter that out just so we don't get distracted by random pitch bend. And send to, and in this case I want none because I want it to just trigger my software instruments, but we can actually route it here to other hardware if we want to. Enable split channels if you want to create separate instrument track inputs for each MIDI channel on your keyboard. I'm going to leave that off. And if you're working with multiple devices, you can enable one to be the default instrument input, so it's set up by default when you create new instruments. And there's also MIDI polyphonic expression that's now available. You can enable that if you're using an MPE-enabled keyboard, which the Novation Impulse isn't. And just to finish up with the start page, here you can optionally sign out or into your MyPreSonus account and Sphere. And here you can monitor transfers that are in progress when you're downloading content. This is for organizing macros, which is a more advanced feature we'll look at later in the series. And here you can manage your SoundCloud information for the SoundCloud section here. So you can now manage your content and downloads all from one location in the Studio One installation menu item from the application menu in the upper left. Configure your audio hardware right on the start page or in the preferences window. And in there, you'll have the audio dropout protection, which is an advanced feature for native low latency monitoring. And it's useful to enable the low latency monitoring option when it's available. It'll bypass effects plugins in the audio path that have greater than 3 milliseconds of latency. But you can also selectively exclude any individual plugins from that if you want. And you also configure your external MIDI devices from the start page or in the preferences window. We'll continue with more in the next video. A lot of us are using audio interfaces with multiple inputs and outputs, and I want to look at setting that up in this video. And to start with, I want to create a song, and I'm going to start with one of the new smart templates, and let's go with the Play Now smart template, where it'll automatically generate a piano for us, and we looked at that last time. But let's look at this window a little more closely so we can select what we want here, and of course we can select from different templates. But the first thing is to give it a name. And then a location, and it'll store this in the default location on your hard drive in your user folder, Documents, Studio One Songs, or click there and you can get a file selector to choose where you want it. And then we can choose the sample rate, and again, this is based on what's available for your audio hardware, and several other settings. The bit depth, time base, if we want to work in bars or seconds, frames. I'm going to work in bars for now. The length, which can be changed, so it doesn't matter. We can even set a default tempo anywhere you want, but this can all be changed. The default time signature and key signature. And this is important. Stretching audio files to tempo can be enabled or disabled, and all of these can be changed after the fact. So these are just initial starting settings to work with. And when you're importing audio, it'll conform it to the tempo with this enabled. And then this, for Studio One users of earlier versions, will notice this is new. We have different customization templates that are available, so we can optionally enable or disable that. And because it's a smart template, it's setting up the basic configuration for us, and we'll look at that probably in another video. But let me leave that on for now and set this up. And now we have our instrument. I'm just going to close this with the tutorial and we can play it. But what I want to get to is under the song menu. First, though, just to take a quick look under view, we have the new customization, edit customizations, and these are the different sets of controls that are available. If I go to complete, for example, you'll see some things changed up here and in the inspector, which is hidden, and we'll get to all this, but I just wanted to show you where this is and we can edit the customization there. But let's just go back to basic for now. So under song, what I want to go to is song setup. And here we have the general information that we set when we created it, and we can change any of this here. And we have the meta information for the artist profile. I can add any or all of this information if I want, and then I can easily store it and update the profile. And this is what I want to get to is the audio I/O setup. So it's defaulted to 2 inputs and 1 pair of outputs. And this interface has a lot more. There's 8 or 10 actually analog inputs, and then there's ADAT and so on. You can even see my voice. I'm plugged into input 1. You can see it triggering here. But I want to add more of the inputs and outputs so they'll be available within my Studio One songs. So we have a matrix here of hardware inputs and software routing, and generally it's a one-to-one match. There's ways of creating very sophisticated, complex routings, but let's stick with the basics for now. I'm going to go add mono. Adding a third input in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'll go with that for now. Now you can name these. Like, for example, I happen to have my input 3 set up as my overhead drum mic on the left, and then that one's the overhead right. I'm just going to name them quickly. I'm just hitting tab to move back and forth. For example, now here, let's make this window a bit bigger so we can see it all. We can click to assign the routing wherever we want, but in this case, I want this one to be assigned to analog 3. I want this one to be assigned to analog 4. And by naming them, I'll see these names in my list within the tracks within Studio One, which is a bit more useful to me than just seeing input 3, input 4, and so on. So with that done, I'm going to click in these. They're already by default lined up with the default one-to-one assignment. And I'm just going to hit apply, and that'll sort of enable them all. And we're good to go. Now I can do the same thing for the outputs where I've got my main outputs, and I can add, in this case, I'm going to add stereo outputs. And I don't need to add that many, but I'm using these to feed my headphones. And this is important when you're creating headphone mixes. And I actually don't even need 3. Now, if you're running, let's say, a surround setup, you might want to enable them all and name them, rear, side, center, and so on. But for that, I'm just going to hit remove there, and I'm just left with the basics that I'm using. And again, I'm going to hit apply to enable them. Now we can add here, and we can add multiple at one time. I did them individually, but you can add multiple channels at once if you're working with huge setups. And you can make this the default, and you can also set the audition output. And I'm going to leave it to main for now for the purposes of our video, but you might want to audition, for example, when you're auditioning loops in the browser or audio files in one of the browsers, for example, you might want to route it somewhere else, but I'm going to leave it at mains. And I can make this the default, which I'm going to do. And it's asking me if I want to make it the default setup, and I'm going to go yes. And we can import or export these audio setups. And I think I'm going to export this because I sometimes do use another audio interface. And just to show you where it's stored, in the users folder under your username, documents, Studio One, IO configuration, and I'll click save, and we're done. We'll continue with more in the next video. Here we are on the start page, and we see that the audio IO song that I created is now at the top of the recent files. So I'm going to single click that to open it. And I want to take a quick look around the main areas of the interface. So this is the main workspace. We see the bar numbers across the top going from left to right, and that's the time base that you'll recall that we chose. We could see minutes and seconds or frames if you're working with video, but we're working with bars. And we see the tracks and channels lined up along here, and we just have this one default instrument called up, the piano sound. Now, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the inspector, and we can get to it by hitting F4 on the keyboard, and that'll toggle that side panel open or closed. And we can also hit this I button over here. And this shows a variety of parameters relating to the track that's selected. And if there are events on this track, like if I had recorded some of this MIDI piano, there would possibly be additional settings relating to the event. Now we're seeing a reduced set of parameters here based on, you'll recall that we have this basic set of controls that are available. And I'm going to open it up to customize it. just to show you how this works. We're in the basic set, and we have the different areas that we can include or exclude components from appearing. And there's the inspector, and we're on an instrument track. So if I, let's say, introduce that, you'll see an additional parameter came into effect. And there I've got node effects now and routing. So that's available here for routing for this instrument, for MIDI input in the channel and so on. And they're not in the basic set, but let's say I decide I want to customize it and I want retrospective recording and node effects, but I don't really need routing. I can then save this by clicking this and save it and restore it as a user-defined set. And I can rename it, delete, and so on. Or I can revert, and it's got some user-defined versions that are unsaved because I haven't saved them, but I've been experimenting. But let's just stick with basic for the moment. So that's the inspector, and F4 will toggle it along with that. Now here at the bottom, we see the console view, and we get to that by hitting F3. And that toggles it open or closed. There's a resize handle here. We can resize it like that, and there's different components that we can view or hide. This is a short view. That's a tall view. This is a skinny view, and that's a wide view. Over here, we see different view of the metering going in. And then over here, we see the output channels. You recall I created those two headphones and the main outputs, so we can hide or reveal those there. Here we get external devices, and I have that one keyboard that you'll recall that we set up. I can see it there. Here I get the instruments that are loaded in this song. So far, it's just this one instrument, Presence, that was loaded by default on this track when I called up the Smart template. And then here we have different scenes for storing different snapshots of mixer setups. We'll get to all this later in the series. Groups and channel configurations. There's different views here that we can use and so on. I'm going to hit F3 to hide it. Now the next view is the editor or edit view, and we're going to hit F2 to open that. And here we get a resizable pane at the bottom, and we're looking at score notation. There's different views here. There's the name of my song and my artist profile. These are all just set up by default. There's even a printer view. And we can get to the different edits over here, or editors here. So this is the main piano view. If we had notes here, we can edit note pitch, length, duration, velocity, and so on. We can edit MIDI controllers, pitch band, aftertouch, and others. Here we have a dedicated drum editor for when we're working with drum kits, and we can edit and create notes and work with drum mappings and so on. And then here's the notation that we looked at originally. And again, there's a little inspector here that updates depending on which pane is selected. So I'm going to hit F2 to close that. Now we can toggle these main views with these buttons over here. Here's Edit, and that'll open and close it, and Mix to open and close the console. And then the browser, which is open by default here, we can toggle that open or close like that. But we can also use the shortcut F5 to open it and close it. And here we have different views. This is a home view where you can jump to these different pages in the browser, or we can get to them by clicking on these tabs. For example, here, instruments, and we can sort by file or folder or vendor name, and there's some settings and so on. And then we have effects plugins that we can, again, sort by vendor, file, or flat list, and different ways of looking at them. These are just visual kind of database view options. And then there's loops that are available. And then we have a file browser to search the volumes on our hard drive for files that we might want to drag and drop and bring in. And then there's an audio pool browser that we're not viewing now. I'm going to drag here and resize and bring that out more. And we get to the pool, and that shows what's used in the song. And currently there's just this one instrument, but we'd see any audio files and or other instruments that are used. And you can access the cloud for PreSonus Sphere and Exchange, and then the shop for buying things. And we can get to all of these by shortcuts as well. So F5 will toggle the browser open or close, and it'll open to whatever was the most recently used tab. It's not necessarily the home tab. So F5 toggles the browser to the most recently viewed tab. F6 will jump directly to instruments. F7 goes to effects. F8 goes to loops. F9 goes to files. And F10 goes to the pool. Now at the bottom, we have some transport controls with counters, transport mechanisms, metronome recording settings, time signature, tempo, and so on. And at the top, we have some tools and then quantizing, snap, nudge, other basic functions. And these can be customized. If I right-click here and go to Customize, I get the customization window. And if I just toggle it for a moment to complete, you'll see that got a lot bigger, and that one did as well. But I'll go back to basic for the moment. And then we can also align this let's say to the left, so you have more space here, or align it to the right or center, and the default is center. And we can customize here as well. And one last F key to show you, F1 will call up the internal help documentation. I don't have mine installed currently, and I have the option to install it, of course. And one little bonus power user key command I want to show you. Let's say you've got several of these open. I've got, let's say, the browser, the inspector, this, and I want to close them all. I can hit Shift F12 to close everything at once, and that'll reopen them again. It'll toggle it. And just F12 alone will open or toggle any floating windows, and there aren't any currently. All right, if you've hung around this long, I'm going to show you some more power user key commands. Now, F2, we know, will open the editor. We can also use this to detach it and then freely resize it as we want. And then we can reattach it using this downward pointing arrow. And once it's detached, we can also pin it so that it'll stay on top. And we can use this to go to full screen mode and then just use escape to revert back. And I'm going to hit X to close it. But the power user tip is F2 will open it. And if we go Command F2, that'll toggle the detached version of it. And that's Control F2 on Windows. Now, same thing works with console view. F3 is the console. We can easily detach it like this, and then we can go full screen if we want. I'm going to hit escape to go back and use that to go back to the docked version. And then we can go Command F3 to toggle the detached version. And that's Control F3 on Windows. So F1 will open the help documentation. F2 opens the editor, and Command or Control on Windows with F2 will toggle the detached version of the editor. F3 opens the console. Command with F3 or Control on Windows toggles the detached version of the console. F4 will open the inspector. F5 to F10, the respective browser views. F12 will toggle floating windows if there are any, and Shift F12 will toggle all the open optional views.